We're here for an event that's in conjunction with a show that I curated that's currently open, and the galleries will be open until 6 p.m., so you can go check it out after if you haven't gotten a chance yet, called Jacob Lawrence, The Legend of John Brown. There will also be a reception following the talk that I hope you'll enjoy. And I want to point out to you that the didactic materials, so all the extra labels, are available on the Davis app, which you can download on your own phone, or you can borrow an iPad at the desk at the Davis. And the exhibition is supported by the Marjorie Schechter Bronfman 38 and Gerald Bronfman Endowment for Works on Paper. And we'll have another event in conjunction with this show on November 30th. I'll be giving a talk in the gallery. So it's a great honor to introduce renowned art historian who's already fussed at me for including that in her bio, but it's so true. And like Jacob Lawrence, she has always had a unique commitment to education and access to art throughout her long career. She was also a friend of Jacob Lawrence and his fellow artist and wife, Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence. The graduate dean emerita and founding director of the Center for Race and Culture at the Maryland Institute College of Art, Dr. Leslie King Hammond has explained that she, quote, always made sure that all those people who thought they weren't part of the opportunity to participate in the arts could find a way to become part of that experience, end quote. While completing her PhD at Johns Hopkins University, she began teaching at MICA in 1973, and she retired from there in 2008. And the school now awards the Leslie King Hammond Graduate Award in her honor. She's published extensively and won numerous awards and curated many important exhibitions. Major exhibitions and publications include Celebrations, Myth and Ritual in African American Art at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the anthology Gumbo Ya Ya, an anthology of contemporary African American women artists, and Over the Line, The Art and Life of Jacob Lawrence. The Studio Museum in Harlem is just one of the institutions to have given her a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she won the Elaine Locke International Prize from the Detroit Institute of the Arts. Her great standing and interest in her work as a scholar is really reflected by the cross-campus interest in the event today. So I really want to thank the art department, especially Nikki Green and Becky Vidal, for co-organizing this event with the Davis today, as well as the Wilson Lecture Fund and the Suzy Newhouse Center for the Humanities and the Harambee House for co-sponsoring this event. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Leslie King Hammond to Wellesley.
I would like to say thank you so much for having me here at Wellesley, my very first visit to Wellesley College. I've been to Boston and the area many, many times, but I've never had the honor to be on this campus, which is absolutely gorgeous. I'd like to thank Amanda and Arthurina for being so diligent, for making my travel as easy and expeditious as possible. And I'd like to dedicate this lecture to two very, very dear friends. My friend, Napoleon Jones Henderson, who is an artist here in Boston, see B word, Boston. And Dr. Faith Parks from the University of Georgia, who is a scholar with me on many projects, and they have traveled here since they heard I was going to be in the area. So the other dedication goes to all the students in the audience. Not that I don't love the rest of you, but there is a special thing about being young and being first introduced to artists and information and culture in a way that I hope will stick with you. Oops. I have spent the balance of my career teaching artists, young artists, some of them a little bit older. Even Napoleon Jones Henderson, for a nanosecond, was a student of mine as a graduate student at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And so my lectures usually are not read. I bore myself by reading papers. I really am very much interested in getting into the art, and oftentimes even what I write, when I go to speak about it and I'm looking at the work, I'm seeing something new all of a sudden, all over again. I began my research on Jacob Lawrence a very, very long time ago. I was a native of New York City, and I was early in my career always fascinated with artists and the creative process of making things. So when I got the opportunity to begin to teach at an art school, which was a very, very different experience, I had to think about how to engage students who were usually on the verge of falling asleep every day because they stayed up all night doing work. And part of it was that I had to get into the process. So I'm like a process junkie. I'm fascinated about how artists begin to actually physically make and manifest images. This is the centennial of Jacob Lawrence's birth. He was born in 1917. And in the 100 years, even though this is 2018, we are still busily reflecting and considering many of the things that Jacob Lawrence tried to do. As a result of this, I have been on, inadvertently, a marathon of lectures around the country talking about Jacob Lawrence, because one of the things that I did do as I began to increasingly write on art historical subjects was that I became the vice president of the Catalog Raisonné project for Jacob Lawrence, which was then produced as the exhibition and publication called Over the Line. And I did the lead essay, which talked about a very, very difficult problem in trying to contextualize or talk about what is the fascination about Jacob Lawrence? Why are we constantly going back and looking at Jacob Lawrence? Why is he so important in history? Well, as a result of this, I have just given a lecture, I would say a couple of months ago at Virginia Tech University, where they had 5 series of Jacob Lawrence exhibitions on display. And then after that, I was invited to, come on in, come on. Find a seat, anywhere. We got plenty over here. Yeah. So as I'm traveling around the country, I see this wonderful exhibition of 5 print series and extra prints that were done as individual commissions at Virginia Tech University. I'm then invited to go to Black Mountain College Museum for their annual conference to talk about Jacob Lawrence, where they have yet another Jacob Lawrence exhibition. So I go, what is going on? Well, last winter I was invited to the Pembroke Essex Museum, which is in Salem, because they are preparing for a 2-year traveling exhibition of Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series, which has not ever been exhibited at all. Perhaps a few panels were exhibited, but by and large, the whole series has never been exhibited. 4 of the panels out of, I believe, the 30 were missing. Last year, they discovered one of the panels that went on auction at Schwann Auction House. And so we will be able now to really get a fuller understanding. But back to the question, because my original lecture, when I was asked to talk, they said, what are you going to talk about? Give us a title, which they always do. And I said, Jacob Lawrence, let's look at his heroes, iconic figures, and the fight for freedom, which are basically the core of what Jacob Lawrence was talking about. But after I did 2 lectures, the first one was a gallery talk. It was not a formal presentation like this. It was a group of people, and they came to see these 5 exhibitions at the Virginia Tech, and they just sort of like wanted to have this very unusual kind of conversation, open conversation forum. And it was like almost like a town hall meeting. And it was fascinating because people actually did come up with questions and observations. The second one was this conference where they were examining the role and the life of Jacob Lawrence as he came as an invitation by Joseph Albers, the renowned, and he was truly renowned. I am just like a little small French fried potato compared to those individuals. As he came down to Asheville, North Carolina, to create this very modernist thing called Black Mountain College, which was this innovative experimental experience for artists to come down and teach and learn new methodologies that had to do with modernism. We're talking about the 1930s and the 1940s. This was really way, way ahead of its time. And Jacob Lawrence and Gwendolyn Knight were invited to come down to Black Mountain. So I get there to Asheville and I go, oh my God, this is really very, very different from my experience at Virginia Tech. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine all of those together. And I'm going to do something called the world of Jacob Lawrence, because nobody really understands who Jacob Lawrence is. And he is truly, without exaggeration, a phenomenon in the history of modernist art. Whoops. Jacob Lawrence, and I'm going to do this. I hate podiums. I sort of like to move around my students, you know, I sort of wake them up. Any student who could sleep through my lectures, I figured needed to sleep. You know. So I wouldn't mark them down or anything like that. I would just let them snooze through the lecture. And then when they woke up, if they woke up, you know, they would engage. Otherwise, I would give them an assignment and send them on. This is the way you have to learn to deal with artists, all right? You have to have a little ebb and flow, all right? So where are we in American history? We are looking at an artist, okay, who is emerging at a point in American history called modernism, okay? At the point that modernism was emerging, nobody knew what the hell it was. It just looked different. Remember, modernism begins to emerge somewhere around, around the First World War. Between the First World War and the Second World War, lots was happening in the world. Traumatic, cathartic. So here are a group of individuals packed up, getting ready to move. What did it mean for African Americans? African Americans, not that long out of slavery from the date and time of this photograph, all right? This is 1940. Were literally trying to wrap their heads around the question of freedom. What is freedom? Thank you for reminding me. Let me turn mine off because mine will go off at the same time. Trust me. Okay? What is the nature of freedom? Many of these families who are descendants of former slaves became families ensconced in sharecropping, another form of slavery, and found themselves bound to the land. But at the same time, they also found that living in the South was a hard, hard life. Minimal opportunities, sad education, no medical care worthy of supporting any kind of quality of life. There were also problems with Jim Crow. There were also problems with the Ku Klux Klan. It was not an easy life for them. So unilaterally, through the help of the black press and the infusion of this thing called modernism that was happening all over the United States, cities, urbanization began to flourish. Tall skyscrapers were being built. Fast trains were being created. Cars. Cities as an entity where people lived as opposed to the country became the new focal point. Jobs, because industry started to emerge all over the United States. And so the black press began to extol the virtues of leaving the South to come north for better opportunities. So that meant, where did they go? From Alabama, from Mississippi, from Louisiana, from South Carolina, North Carolina, from Virginia. All of these places, Tennessee, Texas, people began to merge and migrate north. They also migrated to the Midwest. They also migrated all the way out to California. All of a sudden, cities in the United States found themselves with humongous populations of black people, Negroes or colored people as they were called at the time. And the cities did not know exactly what to do. Places like Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Ohio, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and New York City became enclaves of places where all of a sudden huge, intense, hungry populations of African Americans looking for opportunities where they could have a quality of life that was denied them in the South. Now, that's not to say that as they moved into the North, things got exceptionally better. They were different. They were different. The segregation, the racism, all of the challenges still prevailed, only in a different context. So here are these individuals who are basically from rural experiences, living on farms, many living in one-room houses under very, very stringent conditions, find themselves now living in spaces that are stacked on top of each other. Apartment buildings. Think of cubicles. Just look at the geometry. Boxes on top of boxes on top of boxes. Many of these apartments, oftentimes back in the day when the buildings were being built, each one of the apartments did not have its own bathroom. The bathrooms were located at the end of the hall or a common space. And so you had new kinds of challenges. You also have something else going on in the city. Noise. Noise. If it's New York, constant, perpetual noise. I grew up in a city that never slept, not ever. Something was always going on. What else was going on? Subways, mass transit, taxi cabs. But then there was this place in New York called Harlem. And Harlem was so unique, because Harlem was built up by developers north of Central Park. How many of you have been to New York? Okay, so you know where Central Park is located, all right? The largest public park in the United States, Center City. North of Central Park, above 110th Street, there was a body of land where the developers decided to build up these gorgeous palatial apartments, because they had speculated that they could rent them to the white folks who wanted to live uptown. Banking on the fact that the subway, which had been built only to 59th Street, which was the bottom end of Central Park, would come all the way uptown, and they would be able to rent these apartments to all their potential white communities. Did not happen. All these buildings were built. They were empty and costing money. There were black codes on the books in New York City which said, we cannot rent to black people. Well, the developers were losing money, and they said, oops, we can't pay attention to that. We're going to let all these black people move in because this migration would not be stopped. So people moved into Harlem. This is the Manhattan Temple. BC lunch. What does BC stand for? She's going to die laughing, Faith. Bible Club. You bring your religion with you. All right? You anchor it in the community. At every point, when people moved into the community, they redefined what the spaces were going to be for them. I'm going to take you through a quick odyssey of the work of James Van Der Zee, who was a photographer who came out of Lenox, Massachusetts. He called himself a picture-taking man. Back around, I don't know, maybe about 1908, 910, when he was young. Remember, some of us do remember when you used to get the bubble gum and double bubble, and there used to be cartoons in the double bubble gum, and at the bottom, see those of us, I see you nodding your head, at the bottom of the cartoon, there would be little things where you could send away for $1 or 50 cents for a little toy or a trinket. James Van Der Zee ordered his first camera like that, started taking pictures of the people in his community. Found out he could make money by taking pictures of the people in the community. ooh, this is cool. I think I'll go to New York. He goes to New York. He settles in New York. While he's in New York, he sets up his shop. Here it is. Photographer on the street, all right? And what happens? People who have migrated to New York in the African American community would go to James Vandersea because to have your picture taken and then, one, have it sent home to family members to show them how well I'm doing. See what this different life is bringing. See the opportunities we have. But unbeknownst to James Vandersea and the people whose pictures he was recording, he was creating a mammoth legacy, a history. In 1969, the Metropolitan Museum of Art discovered, I'm going to be a little sarcastic every now and then, discovered that there was a huge black community north of them. And oh, maybe we should pay attention and do a show. So they did a show called Harlem on My Mind, which turned out to be, oh my God, just the worst debacle because, of course, they first claimed they couldn't find any African American artists. We don't know where they are. Harlem had already, as you will see shortly, been booming with black artists, but they had no history. They had no memory. They had no archive until somebody said, you know, there's this old photographer up there who's been taking pictures of Harlem since World War I. Why can't we go and see what he has? Well, long story short, curators went to his apartment. In his apartment, in the tub, in the cabinets, literally 250,000 images of Harlem in every imaginable and unimaginable capacity, including all living people, all the way to all the people who did not make it, who passed at the end of their life, to the little babies who didn't make it, were recorded by this man. Here's James Vandersea inside his house. Now, basically, I don't have a lot of time, but I could spend a whole week on this picture alone because this picture is so telling. Look at it. It's stuffed and stacked with all kinds of what we call signifiers, information that tell us about the quality and the type of life that he was living and that he was showing to his community and to his family and that he was recording. You see this dress, this tablecloth here, this dressing cloth, all right? These were the things that were handmade by women. Anonymous was a woman. How many thrift shops do you go to and you see these doilies? How many of your grandmothers, your aunts have this, all right? This was the way women who could not go and shop in stores would make their homes beautiful. We dismiss all of that. You know, get rid of that. Look at all the pictures around. What is this telling us? He is a man of high culture. Intellectual opportunity was abounding in Harlem. And he did not, as well as any of the artists who were in this area, hesitate to take advantage of this. Got a lot of stuff to show you, so I gotta move. All right? These are high sedity women and men. All right? Well-dressed, well-defined. These are couples. These are married individuals who would have their picture taken and send them home to families or keep them on the mantle to demonstrate their status in life. Why is this so important? Because if you look at the history of in the commercial images that are portrayed of African Americans, I didn't even put any of that stuff in there because we're going to talk about Jacob Lawrence, who was elevating images. The Black Sambos, the Old Black Joes, the Aunt Jemimas, all of these images were used to denigrate the role and the position of African Americans. So these images, what I call, were corrective images. They were images to show, one, we are human beings. We are real people. We are human. We have elegance. We have class. Oh, yes, we have class. Okay? We have style. We have class. And some of us even have money. All right? We came to this city. We came to this place. Now, this was also happening in Chicago. This was happening in Cleveland. This was happening out in in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, Oakland. All of these communities had that segment of the community that was really emerging and really finding a way to take advantage of quote unquote democracy and capitalism. And then, of course, we had just these little sassy sisters, okay? Twins. But twins, see here again, we can pause for a minute, okay? I can go off on another tangent. Twins are very important in the black community, all right? In Nigeria, all right, known to have the highest incident of twin birth in the world among Yoruba women. Every fourth woman is likely to have a twin birth, all right? So twins are sacred. Twins are sacred in the African American community, and when we came through the diaspora and we came to the United States, the twinning did not stop, all right? And so here we have two gorgeous cafe au lait, you know, not too dark, not too light, you know, just a little bit of sugar. And then we had the soldiers. And then you will see that Van der Zee would add little touches, little memories of other soldiers, all right? Soldiers were very important in the shaping and the architectural design of the landscape of a city. What happened? Soldiers went overseas to fight for America in the cause of democracy and freedom. They got over to France and Germany, all these places, and they experienced incredible things that they had not ever experienced here. They came back home and said, wait a minute, my life is on the line. I have friends, family, colleagues, fellow soldiers who died for the cause of freedom, and yet I can't have any freedom here? So the whole mindset of soldiers coming back from World War I and World War II began to change the complexion, the intellectual context of how people were looking. Now, Harlem was also a place where enormous numbers of creative people were beginning to flock. Why? Because when you're an artistic, creative person, you're a weird bird, okay? I was the weird bird in my family, okay? I'm still the weird bird in my family, okay? They were, why? I got two weird birds right here, okay, down front, okay? And they know they are, all right? But we represent 10% of the population. 10% of the population, according to the statistics in the U.S. Bureau of Census, and we are responsible for being able to see beyond the ordinary. We are the makers. We are the problem solvers because we are abstract thinkers. Nobody is like us. We dream in color. The rest of y'all dream in black and white. Ooh. But that is a real fact, okay? I'm sorry, it's true. So here, we have all of these changes fueling this thing called modernism. Modernism really was talking about, I know, this is just too precious, okay? Our children, dancing school. Who doesn't love little munchkins dancing, okay? Down south, in the country and the farms, on the, you know, in the cotton fields, you don't get to do these kinds of things. So here in cities, you began to get a taste of other kinds of lifestyles that would become so critically important to the rest of how America would be seen. This is the community. This is the life that Jacob Lawrence came into. Jacob Lawrence's family, here they are playing checkers on the street. You couldn't go anyplace. You know, you're landlocked into Harlem, into this finite area, all right? The only reason you would go downtown in New York is if you had a job downtown working as a domestic or some kind of common laborer. But up in Harlem, you would see all of these things on the street. Now, most of the people came from the South, but I have to add that my family migrated from the Caribbean. My family came out of Barbados. People came from St. Kitts, Jamaica, Trinidad, into this community. This was the only safe community to go to. People came from West Africa into this community. If you were here in the Caribbean, you would be playing dominoes, not checkers, That would be the game of choice. So here's Jacob Lawrence, born 1917 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. His mother's from Virginia. His father is from South Carolina, Beaufort County. Gullah Geechee is her research area, okay? The family moves from Atlantic City to rural Pennsylvania, then from rural Pennsylvania into Philadelphia. By the time they move into Philadelphia, the parents have separated, and Jacob Lawrence is now, with his brother and sister, placed into foster care so that the mother can work, and she migrates to Harlem to earn money so that she can bring them to Harlem with her. This Harlem. Pool halls. Now, I show you this because as we begin to look at Jacob Lawrence's work, okay, we have to think about where did he get the idea to arrange the compositions? Look at the geometry. Always go back to your ABCs, geometry, all right? Squares, units, blocks, all right? Jacob Lawrence is a young man, about 13, coming into Harlem. All of this is like, oh my God, this has got to be just an abundance of so much visual information that he is processing it in his head. He is not sure everything, and Jake would tell me, you know, when I was growing up, and I was with all of these folks, I wasn't exactly sure of everything I was hearing. But I sat there and I listened and I looked. Jacob Lawrence came, was going to school, did part-time jobs, working in pool halls, working in restaurants, doing anything he could to help his mother, who was a domestic working downtown, to help take care of his brother and his sister. We also have elements in Harlem. Daddy Grace. Daddy Grace, you would have, remember, African Americans brought their religion with them, all kinds of religion. I did a show called Ashe to Amen, African Americans in Biblical Imagery. And in this exhibition, I became fascinated. This is how I met Dr. Parks, okay, because we were working on a project together about the impact of the Bible on African Americans. Now, it's important to pause at this moment because as Africans were brought into the United States and ensconced in plantations, for the purposes of working the land and breeding. I now live in the state of Maryland, and when slavery was outlawed down there, they were relegated to using the African Americans to breed workers, all right? Involuntary, but that's what they did. In the course of that history, reading and writing was forbidden for African Americans. Slave masters, sometimes you would get a benevolent master or mistress, and they would teach their slaves to read or their bonded people to read. But basically, no. And it was so severe that if you were caught reading and writing, it was not uncommon to have this finger, these two fingers cut off. So you could not hold a pencil, all right? It was very severe. However, that did not deter African Americans from wanting to learn, for wanting to create a life and a reality for themselves that had meaning and purpose. And so as they were the friends, quote unquote, of the young master's children, they would listen in and learn how to read or con the young children to teach them the alphabet. And once they learned it, they would go and they would teach each other in private sessions, often secret groves or places within the church or attics where they could learn. After they learned, guess what book they had to learn from, because there were no books available? The American Bible Society, looking for converts to increase the Christian flock, gave out free Bibles all over the United States. Thousands, tens of thousands, millions of Bibles through Africa, through the Caribbean. So having the only book to read, the Bible, was the way African Americans first began to learn the English language and having no one to interpret those stories to them from the Bible, they interpreted the stories themselves and created the Bible to be their own. Read Zora Neale Hurston, who talks about that. So, Daddy Grace was another one of those charismatic individuals who created his own particular genre of spiritual religious belief systems. And then we also had communities. See, LGBTQ was in the world long before Me Too and everything else was going on. Harlem had its own segment, and people of transgendered orientation could go to Harlem because they would have great grand balls. And this is an individual, as you see, Bella the Ball, totally one of my favorite. I was so excited when RuPaul won another Academy Award. You would have thought I got the award. It was like, yes, all right? Because this is part of the American story that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to talk about. People always knew where to go to have a community that would support each other. And Bella the Ball was one of those things. And Vanderzee, he didn't care. He's a picture-taking man. Next, next, next. Everybody, sit down in my studio. I will take anyone's picture. But here is the key, the clincher. This is the reading room at the Schomburg Library. The Schomburg Library was originally known as 135th Street Public Library, New York City. Arthur Schomburg was a Puerto Rican, an Afro-Puerto Rican, who came in. He was a bibliophile. He collected one of the largest known archives of books on the African diaspora, the history in all possible languages that he could get access to. When he passed, the library named this library in Harlem after him. However, this was the library that was the turning point for everyone in the community, because it just wasn't just a library. It was also kind of a sacred space. It was a sanctuary. It was a church. It's where they had lectures. It's where they had workshops. It's where people could do research. And there was nothing more important than, one, being able to tell somebody you could read, prove you could read, prove you could write. From the island that my family came from, Barbados, their motto is literacy and pride. Not pride and literacy. Literacy and pride. And trust me, in my house, if you did not perform, you didn't live in that house. You had to go someplace else, because education was non-negotiable. You had to perform, and you had to perform to the best of your ability. This is where Jacob Lawrence began to spend the bulk of his time as he matured learning. Now, why is this so important? Jacob Lawrence, in American history, and if we look at the education of American artists, is a person, he never finished high school. He never got his GED. Jacob Lawrence never went to college. He never got to go back to high school. Yet Jacob Lawrence was probably more educated than most of the artists of his period and beyond, because Jacob Lawrence began to ask himself really critical questions. And remember, Jacob Lawrence is 13, 14-year-old young man watching people like this gentleman ride through the street, Marcus Garvey. My father was a Garveyite. For those of you who don't know who Garvey was, Garvey lived in a time from Jamaica. It's from my people, from the Caribbean. And he said, I don't like you white people. We're going back to Africa. We're going to have a movement, go back to Africa. And he had people dressed up in uniforms. He had his own armies. He scared the bejesus out of the officials of the FBI and the CIA, to the point where they eventually deported him. All right? He said, no, you have to leave, because you cannot ride around in a car like this. And imagine, here's Vanderzee on the street just taking these pictures, all this history. When the Metropolitan Museum of Art went in there and saw it, they nearly had a freaking heart attack. How did we miss all of this? All right? Well, that's why the universe gave us James Vanderzee, so that we could record it. And then the universe provided us with a place where somebody like Jacob Lawrence could absorb the environment and the attitudes of what was going on at the time and turn it around to show that there was more than one way to learn, that the learning curve did not have to have a particular cycle. In fact, once in an essay I wrote that Jacob Lawrence was educated by the University of Harlem. That's what I call this, the University of Harlem. And when Jacob read it, he went, "That's it. You're right. You are absolutely right." Here is a family who were alliances with, in allegiance with Marcus Garvey. It's a young father dressed in the uniform, and his wife and his son also dressed as a quote unquote a soldier. And here's Jacob Lawrence. Little baby Jacob, little sailor suit. Isn't he adorable? Okay, that's his sister, that's his brother, that's his mother. Unfortunately, as Jacob Lawrence grew to be a young man, he became somewhat estranged from his brother and his sister. His sister died early. His brother died in the 60s, unfortunately, of a drug overdose. But this was not before Jacob Lawrence had already begun to achieve some kind of traction and some kind of recognition with his own career. His mother did not want him. Again, here we are, fantasy, taking pictures of kids on the street. His mother said, "No, you will not be on the street playing." Jacob had no time to play because he was, and I call him an empath. He was a total humanist, all right, to the highest degree and order. He was very aware and very conscious of the struggles that his mother was making to keep the family alive. He was very aware of all the people in the community that he lived with to make a difference in their lives. And he understood the struggle that each one of these people were going through. So Jacob Lawrence's mother said, "No, you don't have time to play out on the street." What she did was, and you see this, it's the Utopia Children's House. This was an after-school program seated here. She said, "When you finish with school, you will go here, so I know where you are and I know what you're doing. I don't want you wandering around." Jacob said his mother was very, very clear about that, and he was abiding, simply because he knew the sacrifices she was making. The Utopia House was an incredible place. It was the beginning of the first Harlem Art Center, and it was the place that really jump-started his career as an artist. Very quickly, and here's Jacob Lawrence. Here he is in the white sweater, and you will see in the back, these are prints that he's doing, linoleum prints, one of the discoveries of the WPA period, which is the Work Project Administration, under the direction of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who at the time, in the aftermath of the Depression in 1929, realized that, oh my God, the people need jobs. I remember, I'm raised by Depression culture parents, and very often my husband will say, "Leslie, you can throw that away. I know how you were raised, okay? We don't have to save everything, okay?" But I'm like, no, let's give it to Goodwill. Somebody else can use it. There's a little life left in this. But when you're raised by Depression culture parents, you begin to understand very quickly that not everyone has the privilege of having had this thing that has ceased to have the life or the quality of functionality that you believe it should have. And so if there's a little life left on it, you want to pass it on, all right? So here's Jacob Lawrence in a school situation, workshop situation, and very quickly his instructors began to realize that Jacob had a particular affinity. Here he is again in another workshop, carvings, all kinds of work going on. And these are early photos that came out of the WPA. Now, while he's at the WPA workshops, he is under the influence of a woman by the name of Augusta Savage. But let me first say that before Augusta really gets into him, who is one of his teachers, Jacob is looking around the community. I remember my father taking me through Harlem because when he migrated from the Caribbean, he lived in Harlem in his youth, and he became very attracted to the culture and the life. And there were people on soapboxes and on ladders giving forth their political or their religious dispositions. This is one of Jacob's very first paintings, his earliest series. It's called The Orator, the Street Orator, okay? And it's taken from the perspective of the people from the ground. All of Jacob Lawrence's paintings, all of his subject matters are from the ground up, not top down, all right? Who were his favorite subjects? It's the everyday person. It's the anonymous person. It's the person who's struggling. It is the worker. The worker is his major, iconic, heroic figure. He celebrates the work ethic. He celebrates the spirit of the ordinary man. Now, in these early works, when he is just a very, very young painter, he talks about what he sees on the street, as seen in that last photograph by Marvin and Morgan Smith. Here's a painting of a woman washing dishes, all right? Now, I do believe she's washing the dishes in the apartments where he lived or where the other women lived, or he might be reflecting on some of the work that his mother might have had to do as a domestic worker. But look at the space, look at the space, look at the floor, all right? When people ask Jacob Lawrence, well, how did you come up with these patterns and things? How did you come up with these designs? And he would say, all the women that I came in contact with, the workers, the teachers, the librarians, anybody who lived in Harlem and you went in their house, my mother decorated the house with rugs. How did Jacob first start to draw? He started copying the patterns of the rugs and the patterns that his mother used to decorate the house to make it look nice. He started to look at the patterns of the crochet and the designs that the women would put in the space to make it a home, to make it comfortable, to make you want to feel like this is where I belong. He also would look at the patterns of the dress, all right, the stripes, the colors, the reds, the yellows, the blues. Notice that these would be primary colors. They pop, they hit, always, always. He wasn't this pastel-y guy. No, all right? He liked to punch it out. He didn't want you to miss the message. This is Augusta Savage. I could go off on Augusta for a while. Augusta was from Cove Springs, Florida. She was a sculptor. A black woman as a sculptor in the 1930s, unheard of. They just about blew her away as if she was a mosquito. They did not pay any attention to her whatsoever. However, coming from Cove Springs, Florida, after having made a statement at a 4-H festival where she carved some little ducks and things in one of 4-H, one of those medals, okay? Her father, who was an Orthodox minister down there, and who beat her every time he found her making a graven image of an object, finally stopped when he saw her make the image of a Virgin Mary. He said, okay, whatever. You're going to do what you're going to do. Go ahead. She left Cold Springs, Florida, went to New York during the Great Migration, ended up at Cooper Union for an interview. Got into the interview. Cooper Union was the only art school in New York that had free tuition, still today, and the only school that would accept students of color. She got there. She had no portfolio. They said, we can't accept you without a portfolio. She said, but I can sculpt. They said, fine, fine. They gave her a big old wad of clay. They said, go away and do something. She came back a few days later, and she had all of this sculpture work laid out that she had done. She was so incredible. She completely passed. They said, no, don't even bother to take the first year. All right? You have gone through the foundation year completely. Let's start you in your sophomore year. She completed that and ended up, long story short, teaching at the Harlem Art Center. Recognized that Jacob Lawrence had this incredible talent. Said, Jake, how old are you? And Jake was something like, 16, 17 years old. She said, well, I'm going to wait and I'm going to watch you when you turn 18. And she knew his birthday. And when he turned 18, she took him down to the office, signed him up at the WPA to become an easel painter. And Jacob Lawrence swears if she had not remembered his birthday and taken him down there, he would not have ever become the artist that he became in his lifetime. Augusta Savage was a very frustrated woman. One, she was a woman, she was black, and she was a sculptor. Oh my God. In the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, please, nothing worse could have happened to a woman. She would get so frustrated, she'd go up to the top of a building and take her sculpture and just throw it down, cuss it out. Boom. Just destroying her work. We have so few of her works left. However, it was her theory and her philosophy that kept the art centers going. It was her curriculum that kept them going. And it was through her workshops which drew all of the artists in the community to study with her, because she not only believed in helping professional artists, but she believed that every single person in the community could have an opportunity and should have an opportunity to be involved in the arts. She would take kids off the street just to work in her studios. Here she is in one of her pieces, now lost. There are really two of them. There's a head back there. It's really on the wall. And this piece, we have no idea where it is, and we suspect that it has been destroyed. But this is to show you the level of accomplishment. She was also one of the ones to build and create one of the huge pieces for the World's Fair back in 1939. Another artist who was teaching at that center is a gentleman in the middle, Charles Alston. He was the leader of a group called the 306 group. And it was at 409, I think, Edgecombe Avenue, where the studio was located. And Jacob Lawrence would go and sit with all of these artists and talk with them. He was just basically, barely 18, 19 years old. Over here in the corner, this diva that you see is Gwendolyn Knight, who he would meet as she was working with Charles Alston, who was also on the WPA mural project doing murals. So Gwen was a painter from Barbados, the island of my family, and they met, and in 1941, they married. Here they are in a gorgeous photo showing how serious they were. They were quite a remarkable team. They never had any children. She was a painter and a sculptor. He was a painter. She helped him to do the research. She was his fiercest critic and his strongest ally and partner. They were inseparable. She was a tiny little lady, but fierce. Don't mess with her. His first, most accomplished series was The Migration. The Migration was a statement on the part of Jacob Lawrence that said, I am going to tell the real, full, total story of American history. The history that's being forgotten, dismissed, invisible. Where did he get the information? The Schomburg Library. He and Gwen would sit there, pore through the books. I never forget giving a lecture once where some of these were on display. And I remember saying to the audience, I said, how many of you have seen this series? And they all raised their hands. And I said, how many of you read the panels with it? And not one hand went up. I said, well, then you didn't see the series. Because Jacob Lawrence was the first artist in American history to attach a text to every image he did in his paneled series, just like you have here on display with the John Brown series, so that you did not miss the intent of what this was all about. He was an extraordinary artist who looked at all kinds of artwork, was very familiar with all of the trends. He had a few courses and workshops here and there at the Art Students League throughout his career. But basically, no. He learned from other artists and he depended on his own innate intellectual genius. Now let's talk about John Brown for a minute, because that's why I was invited here. This is John Brown, young, old. Beginning of life, mature life, end of life. Wow, I had a fascinating time reading about him. He was driven. In his time, white people thought he was a little bit crazy, just a little bit, and so they were very dismissive. During the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, in the aftermath of his demise and his unsuccessful raid on Harper's Ferry, African American, especially artists, were really in deep admiration of what he was trying to do. And all he was trying to do was abolish slavery. He did not believe in it. For 40 years, he worked tirelessly, going into poverty to abolish this thing that he thought was unconscionable. At that point in history, people are looking at this white man who is in, opposition to slavery, and they, the first thing they say, oh, he's got to be crazy. Because the natural order of the belief systems at the time were that these people that were brought in here to work against their will from a country with their own culture, their own beliefs, their own way of life, their own sense of humanity, are at our service. And so, yes, they would try to dismiss him. So I just wanted you to look at him to see who he was. But then I started to think about, this is where I started to expand out from my other lectures, and I started to think about, well, what other African-American artists were working on John Brown, okay? Charles White. Right now, there seems to be a rush, a trend, a flurry. We don't know what to call it. All of a sudden, the eyes are open on African-American artists. It's like, whoops, as if they've just discovered that we are part of the American landscape, all right? And we've been here all along. This is Charles White's version. There's another one, not nearly as accomplished as this one, that is probably on display right now because he too has arrived at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They have finally decided that he's worthy of an exhibition in a major museum of international prominence. But here too, you can see that he was looking at the prior photographs and sort of kind of merging the essence and the strength and the power of those two images. John Brown was just a resilient man. I was reading his history, and this is just like a sidebar. He had 2 wives. First one, he had 7 children. She died after the 7th child. Then he had another wife who he married at 16, which was par for the course in the day. And he had 13 children with her. And it seems that 11 of the children lived to adulthood. So this man was just like, I'm like, wow, this is incredible history. America is just full of riches that we have not been privy to because only a piece of the story, if that much of the story, has been chosen to be told or shared, or even be presented within the academic curriculums of our schools. Public, K through 12, college, most of this stuff was just dashed away. When I did my dissertation on William Henry Johnson at the time, it was the 70s, and they thought I was truly crazy. Hopkins said there is no African American that could possibly be worthy of a Johns Hopkins University dissertation. I said, right. While 1,500 works of this gentleman, William Henry Johnson, from Florence, South Carolina, were in the Smithsonian Institution. I said, what's up with that? This is a national museum. Long story short, I got to do that dissertation. And I remember seeing this, and this is a silkscreen that he did. And Johnson, like Charles White, like Jacob Lawrence, were committed to the cause of telling the stories, of filling the gap of what we are now talking about, which is the great American narrative, filling those gaps in the American narrative of those histories, of those iconic figures, those heroes that we have given little time, energy, or interest to. So here is his version of the flight of John Brown. And here's the trial of John Brown. This is Horace Pippin, all right? This is a period in history, the 30s and the 40s, where African Americans, this is way before what is now known as Black Hysterical Month. This is what Joyce Scott, an artist, calls it. Black Hysterical Month, like February, all of a sudden, it's the time of the year that they discover that we have a history that should be introduced into the corpus of all of American history. These artists at this particular time were very given to doing representational work in a time of modernist history, painting, where abstraction was the vogue, was becoming the vogue. These artists said, no, we cannot go to abstraction yet until we first tell the story of representation, to represent first, all right? And so this is why we see these kinds of works being executed at that point in history. Here is Horace Pippin's hanging of John Brown. And it is reputed that the woman in the corner is his grandmother, who was there and witnessed the hanging. Notice that all of the other subjects, except for one gentleman over here, are focused on this really just dark and very, very tenuous moment. The trees are bare, which is a foreboding of the ensuing death of John Brown, as well as the death of another kind of American efficacy, as you would have it. And then just a few, because there's nothing that I can say better than you going up and seeing the works themselves. In no particular order, these are some of the works that I was looking at. And in terms of the stylization. Now, in many instances, Jacob Lawrence was said to have drawn from Cubism. No. Jacob said, Leslie, don't let anybody tell you that I did Cubism or I was derivative. No. What he was doing was taking the geometry, remember I showed you in the beginning, and then he was slicing, all right, and slithering, and then sometimes dicing it to recreate compositions which talked about the edginess of history as it was being lived at the time in which he experienced it. The interesting part is that this has not changed. Much, of what Jacob Lawrence was talking about is even more vivid today by our standards. Here, this is another one, and see, aesthetically, there is something so beautiful about the way he reinterprets the death of John Brown as a crucifixion, all right? He's an iconic, heroic individual who was demonized by his peers at the time. He had to be punished punitively, all right, for this horrible thing that he was doing, which was to be a soldier in opposition to this horrific thing called slavery. Again, John Brown being a humanist, an empath, all right? It was morally just horrifying to John Brown to have to live in a country that supported this kind of a system. And then finally, in the disparity of Jacob Lawrence's statement, there is no one in the sense of modernism who was not as abstract or as representational. He knew the whole 9 yards. Jacob Lawrence was a man committed to making works that would endure well beyond his lifetime, certainly into our futures and beyond, and make you want to stand up and take notice of the fact that American history and the freedoms that we now so-called enjoy, in spite of Washington, D.C. of late, are something that we have to take more seriously. And so it's been a pleasure to honor you with my few words, and I thank you so much. And if you have questions, I am open. I have a lot of other things I could say. observations? It's not a test. Yes.
The materials that he used, the tempera paint and
Yeah.
the cardboard that he painted
Yeah.
on, I'm guessing must have been reflective of economics. Can you speak a little bit about those materials?
Good question. Yes, the materials that he used throughout his life were usually hardboard or heavyweight paper like watercolor paper. But in the beginning, it was due to the economics and the availability of materials. However, Jacob was very different from most of the artists in his period because he worked with tempera and gouache, water-based paints, very difficult medium to control. And somehow or the other, he developed a synergy, as we say. He developed a way that he was comfortable with the flow of the medium and he knew how to do it. This became extremely important when Jacob would begin to start his series. When he did the migration series, even the John Brown series, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, but especially with the migration series, this is to show you how Jacob's mind worked. Migration series was 60 panels. He drew out all of the panels, every last one of them. And I'm sure that Gwen assisted him in the preparation of this, even though she was really mad when I suggested that one day. And I said, oh yeah, you were one of those women who just stood by your man and did nothing, right? No. I knew that she had to be involved because of the massive scope of it. After he drew in each composition, then Jacob would take one color and he would put the color in on each composition. And then he would do the next color. So that when he put in the last color, the whole series was complete. Consequently, in American history, he is the most cohesive panel series painter there is, because everything was tight. Every work flowed right across. And that's how he did every single series that he did. So you have to think about, wow, what kind of a mind must he have had to be in control of 60 compositions at the same time in gouache. Now that series was so mind-blowing that in history, some of you might have read, that 2 museums, well, first of all, it was exhibited 1941 at the Museum of Modern Art. He was the first African American to have a major exhibition. 2 museums got into a big brouhaha battle. Museum of Modern Art and the Phillips Collection each wanted to buy the series, and Jacob agreed to sell the series. One museum bought all the even numbers, the other museum bought all the odd numbers. And the 2 have been separate ever since. So whenever, if ever, you see this series pulled together, do not miss this show, okay? That was a major turning point in American art history because each museum protects it like it is their baby and you can't touch it. You know, you can't even borrow one panel for an exhibition. Anything else? Yes.
You mentioned that in looking at Lawrence's work, it's from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that it's not only from the ground up, and some of them are from the ground up and the top down at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I think even maybe comes up in the first from the John Brown.
From the John Brown series, yeah, because by that time he learned how to manipulate, and I think that happened when he went to Black Mountain College and he was working with Joseph Albers and all of the other artists. When I went down to Black Mountain College, that was fascinating. It was illuminating because, one, I got to really look at how the different artists who were brought there were encouraged to literally think beyond the box and push the boundaries, beyond any kind of curricular design or, a presupposed understanding about how art should function or art should be taught or art should be made. And it was there that Jacob Lawrence, he spent 6 weeks. He and Gwen spent 6 weeks at Black Mountain College in the Black Mountains of North Carolina in Asheville. And it was through those conversations and those workshops that he began to really, his mind began to see an opening. The other thing that I would suggest is that he had a period in his life where I call a timeout. Okay? He had some emotional, mental issues because there's a lot of weight in a period in history when you're the only one receiving recognition and all of your peers are not. Jacob said, I think I need to take a break. Okay? I need to take a break and step out. And he put himself into a sanitarium for a few months, 3, 4, 6 months, to reconsider. But the thing about Jacob was that you can't trust Jacob, okay? Jacob went in there, and what did he do? You know, you're supposed to do little workshops, you take your meds, whatever. Jake was painting. Jake painted through the entire experience. I think he did it twice, okay? He painted straight on through. And in there, his perception and how he perceived people seeing themselves and being seen, and his situation again shifted, because there is a painting. See, I wasn't going to do this, but come on. Oh, wait a minute. Here's Jacob Lawrence. Here he is under the tree, and he's standing next to a Japanese painter who was also invited to teach. Joseph Albers was way ahead of his time. Albers came out of the Bauhaus school in Germany where there was decadent art, you know, and they burned that stuff, you know. Hitler and them, they just, if they didn't steal it, they burned it, okay? That's how vicious that they were about that period of modernist history. So here's Jacob with all of the other artists within the period that he was invited in the community of Albers and Annie Albers, his wife, who was a fiber artist, drop dead, fabulous fiber artist. She could weave, she could knit, she could crochet. She did things way beyond anything that people imagined could be done with textiles. And the two of them together, Albers and his wife, were riveting to study with. So here's Jacob with this Japanese artist. And, you know, there was also this rumor that Albers had hired this car, this train car, so that Jacob and Gwen could go down and they didn't have to sit in the segregated car, because train cars were segregated at that time. After the lecture was over that I gave, the grandson of this gentleman came up to me and he said, about that rumor about the segregated car, he didn't hire a separate train car. He said, my grandfather told me that he went back to sit with Jake and Gwen in the segregated car to eat lunch so that he did not feel disconnected. See, these are all the pieces of history. And I'm down in Asheville going, I need another day to get in the archives. And there was an archivist there, and I was just like, oh. So anyway, wait a minute. This is what I want to show you. Come on. Okay, and this one, when he's in the WPA workshop, see, Slice and Dice with the geometry. Okay, now this is one where he's at the sanitarium and he's painting workers in the garden as part of their therapy. But this is the one that I want to show you, slums, okay? Take a look at this. This is so un-Jake. Why would Jake paint something nasty like this, all right? But here we are, we the viewers are in the inside of this, captured, locked into this room with a broken can, a trap with a dead mouse or rat, roaches and bugs all the way around. But look at the dichotomy on the outside. Harlem and all its glowing, all right? Jacob's mind was just like, I don't know when he slept. You know, I mean, he was constantly working. I was looking at the years from 1938 to 1941 when he finished John Brown. I don't know how he got all those series done. There were 5 series of work. Unbelievable, all right? He was not even 23 years old, and he was just cranking it out. Then he goes and he starts to do like this. So you're absolutely right about this, but the shift came because this is when he comes east. This is after his Black Mountain experience. And all of a sudden, his vision, his capacity to see beyond just the immediate, like hidden in plain view, All of a sudden, he sees the inside, the outside, the up, the down, all of the different ways in which people are experiencing their lives or find themselves entrapped in their lives. And these are all commentaries. This is what I'm learning with the Pembroke Essex Museum when we're dealing with the struggle series. We're looking at what is the nature of struggle. How does he see it? Because in that one, he's taken pivotal moments in history and he has literally isolated them so that we have to focus on each one. Each one of us scholars, there must be about 8 scholars working on this. They gave us each one panel and 2,500 words to write about this panel. After 350 words, I said, here, take this, I can't stand it anymore. I don't know I don't know how to delete it out. And I had to deal with Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. Oh my God, okay? Oh my God, the myth around the Pocahontas princess, all right? The pumped up histories about Lewis and Clark, all right? So yes, it all comes, and I'm going, this Black Mountain has something to do with this, but I don't know how to get it into this little narrative that I'm having to put. But I could see where the shift came, and it had to do with the aesthetics of geometry that I think that he was dealing with Albers, and also Albers' use of color. Remember, he wrote The Interaction of Color Theory, all right? He went on to be, you know, an icon at Yale University and founded a very important theoretical school. But I think that that was a pivotal moment for Jacob Lawrence in the creation of many of his works, you know?
Do we have a final question, perhaps from a student? Make sure you guys have an opportunity.
They're gonna grill me at dinner.
Right.
They'll grill me at dinner. This is the last one that I used at Black Mountain to let you know that Jacob Lawrence was very aware of all the problems from every political persuasion. And this is called Wounded Man. This is from the 60s, all right, which is ever more potent today than it ever was at the time that he did it. This is just absolutely scary. Every time I go back and look at that book, if you are interested in it, get the book, get the catalog raisonné over the line. There were about 10 scholars in it. We all worked together we had several scholars meetings to put it together. And Jacob worked with us on it. He was alive through the whole process. He read all of our essays. Yes, no, okay, take that out. You can't have a better project or a better experience in your life. And I've just been so blessed to be that close to working with an artist who taught me so much. And I'm still learning, still seeing, still thinking about it. Thank you all so much.